This was not a routine diplomatic spat. It was not just another loud exchange built to dominate a single news cycle and disappear beneath the next wave of outrage. What unfolded carried a weight that the headline alone could not contain. When Donald Trump stood in Davos and declared that Canada lives because of the United States, and Mark Carney answered with a response so measured, so disciplined, and so unapologetically sovereign that it echoed far beyond the immediate moment. The real story was not the insult itself. The real story was the line that suddenly became visible. A boundary was tested, and for a brief, electrifying instant, the world saw what happens when old-style intimidation collides with a colder, steadier, and more strategic form of resistance. Because this was never only about words spoken at an international forum. It was about hierarchy. It was about whether a neighboring democracy, deeply tied to the United States by geography, trade, defense, and decades of institutional familiarity, could still be treated as an instrument in another nation's domestic theater. It was about whether political force projected with enough volume and enough menace could still push allied governments into postures of quiet deference. And the answer that came back, not in a legal memo and not in the language of diplomatic evasions, but in the rhythm of political counterforce, was clear. Not this time, not in that tone. Not in that register. That is why the reaction mattered. Because power is never just what is said. Power is what lands, what endures, and what the audience recognizes as legitimate. Trump's method has always depended on asymmetry. He does not simply argue. He overwhelms, he does not merely criticize. He tries to define the emotional terrain on which everyone else must respond. The goal is larger than winning a point. The goal is to impose a frame so dominant that others begin speaking inside it, trimming their language, narrowing their confidence, and yielding the emotional center of the confrontation. That is how modern populist dominance is built, not only through policy but through atmosphere, not only through institutions but through intimidation. For years, through tariff threats, annexation rhetoric, and the repeated public belittling of Canadian leaders, that method worked often enough to feel like doctrine. But all doctrines decay when the environment changes. A tactic that frightens fragmented opponents can fail when it meets disciplined rebuttal and an audience prepared not to flinch. That is what made Carney's response so consequential. He did not merely reply to an attack, he neutralized the method behind it. He refused the emotional script. He did not shrink the confrontation in order to appear careful. He elevated it in order to redefine it. What could have remained a loud insult became, through his answer, a question of national dignity, political maturity, and strategic self-respect. In that moment, the issue was no longer simply what Trump had accused, implied, or threatened. The issue became something larger and more dangerous. For the aggressor, who gets to define Canada's identity and who gets to speak for stability in an era of deliberate destabilization, that reversal is the heart of the backfire. What was intended as a demonstration of dominance became an exposure of limits. The spectacle turned, the current reversed, the attack expanded the stature of the target. That is one of the oldest laws in politics. When coercive language is used against a figure who can translate pressure into composure, the aggressor can discover too late that he has built the platform for his opponent's rise. Trump's remarks did not land in a vacuum by publicly suggesting that Canada survives only because of the United States. By personalizing the confrontation, by treating humiliation as a tool of strategic signaling, he followed a familiar playbook. The expectation behind such behavior is simple: silence, hedging, deference, or visible anxiety. The target is supposed to look smaller. The audience is supposed to internalize the hierarchy. But what came back was the opposite. Instead of confirming weakness, Canada's answer projected ballast. Instead of validating dependency, the response asserted identity. And once that happened, the logic of the entire encounter changed. The confrontation stopped being a demonstration of American control and became a demonstration of the limits of bluster when it meets disciplined refusal. Carney's advantage in that kind of moment is not merely that he speaks well, it is that he symbolizes a radically different political tradition. On one side stands disruption as instinct, instability as leverage, and conflict as personal theater. On the other stands managerial legitimacy, institutional memory, financial literacy, and the cultivated language of state endurance. In calmer times, that second model can look bloodless. It can seem too restrained for an era intoxicated by spectacle. But under pressure, the hierarchy flips. Steadiness stops looking dull and starts looking strong. Seriousness stops feeling detached and starts feeling protective. Precision becomes power because the public suddenly understands exactly what is being defended. That is why Carney's answer mattered. He acknowledged the depth of the U.S. Canada relationship, but then drew a line that could not be blurred. Canada, in that framing, does not exist by permission. It exists in its own right, with its own legitimacy, its own future, and its own political will. That is why the public reaction carried so much force. Crowds do not respond so intensely only because a sentence sounds clever. They respond when they feel relief. They respond when someone finally says, in unmistakable terms, what they feared was no longer being said on their behalf. The reaction was emotional, but it was also constitutional. In spirit, it was the sound of a political community recognizing itself again, not as an object inside someone else's performance, but as an actor with its own boundaries and its own voice. In democratic life, legitimacy does not live only in election law or constitutional procedure. It also lives in moments when a population senses that someone has articulated the line between negotiation and humiliation, and when that line is publicly restored, the energy released can be enormous. It is not just applause, it is ratification. It is a society telling itself that the frame imposed from outside has been rejected. There is a wider lesson here, and it reaches beyond Canada. For decades, many U.S. allies absorbed turbulence from Washington because they believed the underlying architecture would hold. Personalities would come and go, but treaties would endure. Outbursts would happen, but institutions would restore equilibrium. The center might bend, but it would not break. That psychology has changed. Repeated shocks have taught allies to treat American volatility not merely as noise around a stable core, but as a structural variable that must now be priced into strategy. Once that shift occurs, every threat, every insult, and every impulsive declaration is processed differently. It is not theater alone, it is data, it is not an aberration, it is a warning. Canada sits at the center of that recalculation in a uniquely exposed way, because no major country is so integrated with the United States while also being so determined to preserve a distinct national identity. Canada cannot relocate, it cannot detach, it cannot pretend that geography does not matter. Trade, security coordination, supply chains, and cultural interdependence tie enormous parts of its national horizon to Washington. Yet proximity creates its own nationalism. The closer the pressure, the stronger the need for distinction. That is why sovereignty, in Canada's case, is not defended through distance. It is defended through posture, institutions, diversification where possible, and the repeated public demonstration that partnership does not mean submission. This is where middle powers survive or fail. They do not survive by outmuscling the giant beside them. They survive by increasing the political cost of disrespect. They convert identity into resilience, law into leverage, alliances into insulation, and public unity into deterrence. That is the deeper significance of this moment. Carney did not answer as though he were involved in a personal feud. He answered as though the political order surrounding Canada itself was being tested. That matters economically as well as symbolically. Investors do not hear only rhetoric when allied states are attacked. They hear future friction. They hear risk premiums, tariffs, retaliation, supply chain disruption, border slowdowns, and the politicization of what should be stable commercial assumptions. North America's economic strength has depended for decades on predictability inside interdependence. Once political leaders begin treating that interdependence as a weapon to be brandished, the calculation changes. Companies build buffers, supply chains seek redundancy. Capital moves from pure efficiency toward resilience. In that sense, the backfire is not only reputational, it is structural. The short-term tactic may energize a political base or dominate a media cycle, but the long-term effect can erode trust inside the very sphere of influence that power depends upon. Great powers do not lead by frightening close partners indefinitely. They lead by making alignment feel safer than estrangement. When that belief weakens, influence begins to drain long before alliances formally break. Canada, in this confrontation, becomes more than a target. It becomes a mirror. What happens in the U.S. Canada relationship reveals something intimate about the state of the wider democratic order. If even this relationship begins to function as a stage for symbolic dominance tests rather than structured cooperation, then the message to the rest of the world is unmistakable. The Atlantic system is no longer governed primarily by confidence. It is governed by volatility. And when volatility becomes the signature of the center, everyone else adjusts, rivals probe, opportunists bargain harder, allies hedge, every domestic flourish begins to carry international costs. Because the audience outside no longer separates internal political theater from external reliability. That is why Carney's response registered so powerfully. It was not just resistance, it was stabilization under pressure. It said, in effect, that seriousness still has a language and that democratic dignity can still be defended without descending into theatrical chaos. That distinction matters because mimicry is a trap. Leaders confronted by high-volume political aggression often assume they must imitate the aggressor's style in order to survive. But once everyone speaks the language of destabilization, destabilization wins. The more difficult path is to absorb the blow, redirect the frame, and emerge. Looking larger rather than louder. That is what turns a political answer into strategic communication. States do not communicate only through treaties, sanctions, and military deployments. They also communicate through visible moments of elite behavior. When a leader answers pressure with composure and precision, that performance travels. Citizens feel less cornered. Institutions feel less isolated. Foreign observers update their calculations. And that is where the backfire becomes truly dangerous for the aggressor. What was supposed to fragment the other side instead consolidates it. People previously divided on other matters suddenly recognize a primary one: sovereignty. Respect, and the inadmissibility of external belittlement. In that kind of environment, the attack does not weaken the target, it clarifies it. Once consolidation starts, it does not remain emotional for long. It moves from the rally to the cabinet table, from public mood to policy design, from symbolic reaction to structural adjustment. A country that feels publicly challenged begins asking harder questions. How dependent is too dependent? Which industries require insulation? Which trade routes need reinforcement? Which alliances should be deepened? Which institutions must be prepared for repeated external shocks? These are not sentimental questions. They are statecraft questions, and if enough such moments accumulate, countries do not merely complain, they redesign quietly at first, then permanently. That is how geopolitical eras change, not always through one dramatic rupture, but through repeated episodes that convince states their old assumptions are no longer safe. What looks on the surface like a clash of personalities can therefore become an early marker of a larger transition. The danger for the United States is that coercive language intended to enforce dependency can instead accelerate the search for alternatives. This is where the story expands into something even larger. We are living through a period in which old assumptions about the behavior of major democracies are under revision. Domestic populism no longer stays domestic. Economic nationalism does not stop at the border. Personalist politics does not remain personal when exercised by figures attached to great power machinery. Every democratic ally now faces a difficult question. How do you remain integrated with a giant partner whose political currents may, at any moment, seek advantage through insult, instability, or threat? There is no simple solution, but one principle is already visible. You cannot answer that problem by acting smaller than you are. Carney's response rejected smallness. It rejected the posture of careful shrinkage that often defines middle power anxiety, and that is why it felt bigger than a normal political answer. It offered a template. Many democracies are now searching for firmness without hysteria, confidence without illusion, and partnership without dependence of spirit. There is also an inward-facing consequence for the United States itself. When a neighboring democracy is attacked and the result is a resonant assertion of dignity from the other side, the spectacle rebounds inward. It forces American observers to ask what exactly is being projected in their name. Is this strength or compulsion mistaken for strength? Is this leadership or appetite misread as authority? Power is not measured only by the ability to threaten, insult, or dominate a news cycle. It is measured by the quality of order one can sustain around oneself. A superpower that unsettles close allies for domestic applause may not be displaying confidence. It may be displaying strategic impatience at war with its own long-term interests. That is why the deeper meaning of this moment cannot be captured by treating it as just another exchange in an age of endless conflict. Beneath the noise, an alternative model of authority briefly came into view, one rooted in control, fluency, and institutional seriousness. That is not a trivial development. It suggests that even in an era saturated with spectacle, there is still a constituency for leadership that looks like adulthood. And adulthood is in short supply across much of the democratic world. In unstable periods, publics may reward disruption, flirt with chaos, and romanticize transgression. But when they begin to sense that the disruption is no longer merely rebellious, but dangerous to trade, dangerous to alliances, dangerous to price stability, and dangerous to the credibility of the state itself, they start looking for another center. Not a passive center, not a bland center, a forceful center that can say no, absorb pressure, and remain standing. That is why competence may now be acquiring a new kind of populist power. Not because it simplifies the world, but because it answers a growing public hunger for restored control. In that framing, Carney becomes more than a technocrat answering an insult. He becomes the symbol of a promise that democratic strength can still be disciplined, articulate, and unbaited. For Canada, the implications are profound. A country long accustomed to defining itself carefully in relation to the United States may now feel permission to define itself more assertively against forms of American pressure that violate the etiquette of alliance. That does not require anti-Americanism. It requires strategic differentiation. Mature partnerships depend on respect that survives disagreement, and when that respect is publicly challenged, the answer cannot always remain hidden behind closed doors. Sometimes a nation must hear itself defended in unmistakable terms. Sometimes deterrence begins in language. That is what this looked like, deterrence in language. The refusal to accept the definition imposed by another, the refusal of the frame, the refusal of the hierarchy. And that is why this moment matters beyond its immediate spectacle. It showed that an attack intended to diminish Canada instead elevated the principle that Canada cannot be casually diminished. It showed that a performance meant to project force instead highlighted the enduring power of disciplined democratic reply. And if that threshold has now been crossed, then this was not just a backfire. It was a signal that the old habits of deference are weakening, that the terms of Western partnership are being renegotiated in real time, and that the consequences of that shift are only beginning to arrive.